Section 26 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. All About Coffee by William Ukers. Chapter 20. Cultivation of the Coffee Plant. The early days of coffee culture in Abyssinia and Arabia. Coffee cultivation in general. Soil, climate, rainfall, altitude, propagation, preparing the plantation, shade and windbreaks, fertilizing, pruning, catch crops, pests and diseases. How coffee is grown around the world. Cultivation in all the principal producing countries. For the beginnings of coffee culture, we must go back to the Arabian colony of Harar in Abyssinia. For here it was, about the 15th century, that the Arabs, having found the plant growing wild in the Abyssinian highlands, first gave it intensive cultivation. The complete story of the early cultivation of coffee in the Old and New Worlds is told in Chapter 2, which deals with the history of the propagation of the coffee plant. Larocque was the first to tell how the plant was cultivated and the berries prepared for market in Arabia, where it was brought from Abyssinia. The Arabs raised it from seed grown in nurseries, transplanting it to plantations laid out in the foothills of the mountains, to which they conducted the mountain streams by ingeniously constructed small channels to water the roots. They built trenches 3 feet wide and 5 feet deep, lining them with pebbles to cause the water to sink deep into the earth, with which the trenches were filled to preserve the moisture from too rapid evaporation. These were so constructed that the water could be turned off into other channels when the fruit began to ripen. In plantations exposed to the south, a kind of poplar tree was planted along the trenches to supply needful shade. Larocque noted that the coffee trees in Yemen were planted in lines, like the apple trees in Normandy, and that when they were much exposed to the sun, the shade poplars were regularly introduced between the rows. Such cultivation as the plant received in the early Abyssinia and Arabia was crude and primitive at best. Throughout the intervening centuries, there has been little improvement in Yemen, but modern cultural methods obtain in the Harar district in Abyssinia. Like the Arabs in Yemen, the Harari cultivated in small gardens, employing the same ingenious system of irrigation from mountain springs to water the roots of the plants at least once a week during the dry season. In Yemen and in Abyssinia, the ripened berries were sun-dried on beaten earth barbecues. The European planters who carried the cultivation of the bean to the Far East and to the America followed the best Arabian practice, changing and sometimes improving it in order to adapt it to local conditions. Coffee cultivation in general. Today, the commercial growers of coffee on a large scale practice intensive cultivation methods, giving the same care to preparing their plantations and maintaining their trees as do other growers of grains and fruits. As in the more advanced methods of arboriculture, every effort is made to obtain the maximum production of quality coffee consistent with the smallest outlay of money and labor. Experimental stations in various parts of the world are constantly working to improve methods and products and to develop types that will resist disease and adverse climate conditions. While cultivation methods in the different producing countries vary in detail of practice, the principles are unchanging. While methods do differ, it is owing principally to local economic conditions such as the supply and cost of labor, machinery, fertilizers, and similar essential factors. Soil. Rocky ground that pulverizes easily and, if possible, of volcanic origin is best for coffee. Also, soil rich in decomposed mold. In Brazil, the best soil is known as terra roxa, a topsoil of red clay, 3 or 4 feet thick with a gravel subsoil. Climate. The natural habitat of the coffee tree, all species, is tropical Africa, where the climate is hot and humid and the soil rich and moist, yet sufficiently friable to furnish well-drained seed beds. These conditions must be approximated when the tree is grown in other countries. Because the trees and fruit generally cannot withstand frost, they are restricted to regions where the mean annual temperature is about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, with an average minimum about 55 degrees and an average maximum of about 80 degrees. Where grown in regions subject to more or less frost, as in the northernmost parts of Brazil's coffee-producing district, which lie almost within the south temperate zone, the coffee trees are sometimes frosted, as was the case in 1918, when about 40% of the Sao Paulo crop and trees suffered. Generally speaking, the most suitable climate for coffee is a temperate one within the tropics. However, it has been successfully cultivated between latitudes 28 degrees north and 38 degrees south. Rainfall. Although able to grow satisfactorily only on well-drained land, the coffee tree requires an abundance of water, about 70 inches of rainfall annually, and must have it supplied evenly throughout the year. Prolonged droughts are fatal, while, on the other hand, too great a supply of water tends to develop the wood of the tree at the expense of the flowers and fruit, especially in low-lying regions. Altitude. Coffee is found growing at all altitudes, from sea level up to the frost line, which is about 6,000 feet in the tropics. Robusta and Liberica varieties of coffee do best in regions from sea level up to 3,000 feet, while Arabica flourishes better at the higher levels. Carvalho says that the coffee plant needs sun, but that a few hours daily exposure is sufficient. Hilly ground has the advantage of offering the choice of a suitable exposure, as the sun shines on it for only a part of the day. Whether it is the early morning or the afternoon sun that enables the plant to attain its optimum conditions is a question of locality. The first steps in coffee growing. In Mexico, Romero tells us, the highlands of Soconusco have the advantage that the sun does not shine on the trees during the whole of the day. On the higher slopes of the Cordilleras, from 2,500 feet above sea level, clouds prevail during the summer season, where the sun is hottest, and are frequently present in the other seasons after 10 o'clock in the morning. These keep the trees from being exposed to the heat of the sun during the whole of the day. Perhaps to this circumstance is due the superior excellence of certain coffees grown in Mexico, Colombia, and Sumatra at an altitude of 3,000 feet up to 4,000 feet above sea level. Richard Spruce, the botanist, in his notes on South America, as quoted by Alfred Russel Wallace, refers to a, quote, zone of equatorial Andes ranging between 4,000 and 6,000 feet altitude, where the best flavored coffee is grown, unquote. Propagation. Coffee trees are grown most generally from seeds selected from trees of known productivity and longevity, although in some parts of the world propagation is done from shoots or cuttings. The seed method is most general, however, the seeds being either propagated in nursery beds or planted at once in the spot where the mature tree is to stand. In the latter case, called planting at stake, 4 or 5 seeds are planted, much as corn is sown, and after germination, all but the strongest plant are removed. Where the nursery method is followed, the choicest land of the plantation is chosen for its site, and the seeds are planted in forcing beds, sometimes called cold frames. When the plants are to be transplanted directly to the plantation, the seeds are generally sown 6 inches apart in rows, separated by the same distance, and are covered with only a slight sprinkling of earth. When the plants are to be transferred from the first bed to another, and then to the plantation, the seeds are sown more thickly, and the plants are pricked out as needed, and set out in another forcing bed. During the 6 to 7 weeks required for the coffee seed to germinate, the soil must be kept moist and shaded and thoroughly weeded. If the trees are to be grown without shade, the young plants are gradually exposed to the sun to harden them before they begin their existence in the plantation proper. Coffee scenes in Java, Netherlands, East Indies. Considerable experimental work has been done in renewing trees by grafting, notably in Java, but practically all commercial planters follow the seed method. Preparing the plantation. Before transplanting time has come, the plantation itself has been made ready to receive the young plants. Coffee plantations are generally laid out on heavily wooded and sloping lands, most often in forests or mountainsides and plateaus, where there is an abundance of water, of which large quantities are used in cultivating the trees and in preparing the coffee beans for market. The soil most suitable is friable, sandy, or even gravelly, with an abundance of rocks to keep the soil comparatively cool and well drained, as well as to supply a source of food by action of the weather. The ideal soil is one that contains a large portion of potassium and phosphoric acid, and for that reason, the general practice is to burn off the foliage and trees covering the land to use the ashes as fertilizer. In preparing the soil for the new plantation under the intensive cultivation method, the surface of the land is lightly plowed and then followed up with a thorough cultivation. When transplanting time comes, which is when the plant is about a year old and stands from 12 to 18 inches high with its first pairs of primary branches, the plants are set out in shallow holes at regular intervals of from 8 to 12 or even 14 feet apart. This gives room for the root system to develop, provides space for sunlight to reach each tree, and makes for convenience in cultivating and harvesting. Liberica and Robusta type trees require more room than Arabica. When set 12 feet apart, which is the general practice, with the same distance maintained between rows, there are approximately 450 trees to the acre. In the triangle or hexagon system, the trees are planted in the form of an equilateral triangle, each tree being the same distance, usually 8 or 9 feet, from its 6 nearest neighbors. This system permits of 600 to 800 trees per acre. Shade and windbreaks. Strong, chilly winds and intensely hot sunlight are foes of coffee trees, especially of the Arabica variety. Accordingly, in most countries, it is customary to protect the plantation with windbreaks, consisting of rugged trees, and to shade the coffee by growing trees of other kinds between the rows. The shade trees serve also to check soil erosion, and in the case of the leguminous kind, to furnish nutriment to the soil. Coffee does best in shade, such as afforded by the silk oak, Grevillea robusta. In Shade of Coffee Culture, Bulletin 25, 1901, Division of Botany, United States Department of Agriculture, O.F. Cook goes extensively into this subject. The methods employed in the care of a coffee plantation do not differ materially from those followed by advanced orchardists in the colder fruit belts of the world. After the young plants have gained their start, they are cultivated frequently, principally to keep out the weeds, to destroy pests, and to aerate the earth. The implements used range from crude hand plows to horse-drawn cultivators. Fertilizing. Comparatively little fertilizing is done on plantations established on virgin soil until the trees begin to bear, which occurs when they are about 3 years of age. Because the coffee tree takes potash, nitrogen, and phosphoric acid from the soil, the scheme of fertilizing is to restore those elements. The materials used to replace the soil constituents consist of stable manure, leguminous plants, coffee tree prunings, leaves, certain weeds, oil cake, bone and fish meal, guano, wood ash, coffee pulp and parchment, and such chemical fertilizers as superphosphate of lime, basic slag, sulfate of ammonia, nitrate of lime, sulfate of potash, nitrate of potash, and similar materials. The relative values of these fertilizers depend largely upon local climate and soil conditions, the supply, cost, and other like factors. The chemical fertilizers are coming into increasing use in the larger and more economically advanced producing countries. Brazil particularly is showing in late years a tendency toward their adoption to make up for the dwindling supply of the so-called natural manures. As the coffee tree grows older, it requires a larger supply of fertilizer. Pruning. On the larger plantations, pruning is an important part of the cultivation processes. If left to their own devices, coffee trees sometimes grow as high as 40 feet, the strength being absorbed by the wood, with the consequent scanty production of fruit. To prevent this undesirable result, and to facilitate picking, the trees on the more modern plantations are pruned down to heights ranging from 6 to 12 feet. Except for pruning the roots, when transplanting, the tree is permitted to grow until after producing its first full crop before any cutting takes place. Then, the branches are severely cut back, and thereafter, pruning is carried on annually. Topping and pruning begins between the first and second years. Coffee trees, as a rule, produce full crops from the 6th to the 15th year, although some trees have given a paying crop until 20 or 30 years old. Ordinarily, the trees bear from 1/2 pound to 8 pounds of coffee annually, although there are accounts of 12-pound bags being obtained per tree. Production is mostly governed by the cultivation given the tree and by climate, soil, and location. When too old to bear profitable yields, the trees on commercial plantations are cut down to the level of the ground and are renewed by permitting only the strongest sprouts springing out of the stump to mature. Catch crops. On some plantations, it has become the practice to grow catch crops between the rows of coffee trees, both as a means of obtaining additional revenue and to shade the young coffee plants. Corn, beans, cotton, peanuts, and similar plants are most generally used. Pests and diseases. The coffee tree, its wood, foliage, and fruit have their enemies, chief among them which are insects, fungi, rodents, the coffee rat, birds, squirrels, and, according to Rosignon, elephants, buffalo, and native cattle, which have a special liking for the tender leaves of the coffee plant. Insects and fungi are the most bothersome pests on the most plantations. Among the insects, the several varieties of borers are the principal foes, boring into the wood of the trunk and branches to lay larvae, which sap the life from the tree. There are scale insects whose excretion forms a black mold on the leaves and affects the nutrition by cutting off sunlight. Numerous kinds of beetles, caterpillars, grasshoppers, and crickets attack the coffee tree leaves, and so-called leaf miner being especially troublesome. The Mediterranean fruit fly deposits larvae, which destroy or lessen the worth of the coffee berry by tunneling within and eating the contents of the parchment. The coffee berry beetle and its grub also live within the coffee berry. Among the most destructive fungoid diseases is the so-called Ceylon leaf disease, which is caused by the Hemilea vastatrix, a fungus related to the wheat rust. It was this disease which ruined the coffee industry in Ceylon, where it first appeared in 1869, and since has been found in other coffee-producing regions of Asia and Africa. America has a similar disease, caused by the Phaerostomi flavida, that is equally destructive if not vigilantly guarded against. See chapters 15 and 16. The coffee tree roots also are subject to attack. There is the root disease, prevalent in all countries, and for which no cause has yet been definitely assigned, although it has been determined that it is of fungoid nature. Brazil and some other American coffee-producing countries have a serious disease caused by the eelworm, and for that reason called the eelworm disease. Coffee planters combat pests and diseases principally with sprays, as in other lines of advanced arboriculture. It is a constant battle, especially on the large commercial plantations, and constitutes a large item on the expense sheet. Cultivation by countries. Coffee cultivation methods vary somewhat in detail in the different producing countries. The foregoing description covers the underlying principles in practice throughout the world, while the following is intended to show the local variations in vogue in the principal countries of production, together with brief descriptions of the main producing districts, the altitudes, character of soil, climate, and other factors that are particular to each country. In general, they are considered in the order of their relative importance as producing countries. Brazil. In Brazil, the giant of South America and the world's largest coffee producer, the methods of cultivation naturally have reached a high point of development, although the soil and the climate were not at first regarded as favorable. The year 1723 is generally accepted as the date of the introduction of the coffee plant into Brazil from French Guiana. Coffee planting was slow in developing, however, until 1732, when the governor of the states of Pará and Maranhão urged its cultivation. 16 years later, there were 17,000 trees in Pará. From that year on, slow but steady progress was made, and by 1770, an export trade had begun from the port of Pará to the countries in Europe. The spread of the industry began about this time. The coffee tree was introduced into the state of Rio de Janeiro in 1770. From there, its cultivation was gradually extended into the states of São Paulo, Minas, Goiás, Bahia, and Espírito Santo, which have become the great coffee-producing sections of Brazil. The cultivation of the plant did not become especially noteworthy until the third decade of the 19th century. Large crops were gathered in the season of 1842 to 43, and by the middle of the century, the plantations were producing annually more than 2 million bags. Brazil's commercial coffee growing region has an estimated area of approximately 1,158,000 square miles and extends from the river Amazon to the southern border of the state of São Paulo and from the Atlantic coast to the western boundary of the state of Mato Grosso. This area is larger than that section of the United States lying east of the Mississippi River, with Texas added. In every state of the Republic, from Ceará in the north to Santa Catarina in the south, the coffee tree can be cultivated profitably and is, in fact, more or less grown in every state, if only for domestic use. However, little attention is given to the coffee growing in the north, except in the state of Pernambuco, which has only about 1,500,000 trees, as compared with 764 million trees of São Paulo in 1922. The chief coffee-growing plantations in Brazil are situated on plateaus seldom less than 1,800 feet above sea level and ranging up to 4,000 feet. The mean annual temperature is approximately 70 degrees Fahrenheit, ranging from a mean of 60.8 degrees in winter to a mean of 72 degrees in summer. The temperature has been known, however, to register 32 degrees in winter and 97.7 degrees in summer. While coffee trees will grow in almost any part of Brazil, experience indicates that the two most fertile soils, the terra roxa and the masape, lie in the coffee belts. The terra roxa is a dark red earth and is particularly confined to São Paulo, and it is due to the predominant coffee productivity of that state. Masape is a yellow, dark red, or even black soil and occurs more or less contiguous to the terra rossa. With a covering of loose sand, it makes excellent coffee land. Brazil planters follow the nursery-propagated method of planting and cultivate, prune, and spray their trees liberally. Transplanting is done in the month from November to February. Coffee growing profits have shown a decided falling off in Brazil in recent years. In 1900, it was not uncommon for a coffee estate to yield an annual profit from 100 to 250%. 10 years later, the average return did not exceed 12%. In Brazil's coffee belt, there are two seasons, the wet, running from September to March, and the dry, running from April to August. The coffee trees are in bloom from September to December. The blossoms last about 4 days and are easily beaten off by light rains or winds. If the rains or winds are violent, the green berries may be similarly destroyed, so that great damage may be caused by unseasonable rains and storms. The harvest usually begins in April or May and extends well into the dry season. Even in the picking season, heavy rains and strong winds, especially the latter, may do considerable damage. For in Brazil, shade trees and windbreaks are the exception. Approximately 25% of the São Paulo plantations are cultivated by machinery. A type of cultivator very common is similar to the small corn plow used in the United States. The Planet Junior, manufactured by a well-known United States agricultural machinery firm, is the most popular cultivator. It is drawn by a small mule, with a boy to lead it and a man to drive and to guide the plow. The preponderance of the coffee over other industries in São Paulo is shown in many ways. A few years ago, the registration of laborers in all of industries was about 450,000, and of this total, 420,000 were employed in the production and transportation of coffee alone. Of the capital invested in all industries, about 85% was in coffee production and commerce, including the railroads that depended upon it directly. An estimated value of $482,500,000 was placed upon the plantations in the state, including land, machinery, the residencies of owners, and laborers' quarters. In all Brazil, there are approximately 1,200,000,000 coffee trees. The number of bearing coffee trees in São Paulo alone increased from 735 million in 1914-15 to 834 million in 1917-18. The crop in 1917-18 was 1,615,000,000 pounds, one of the largest on record. In the agricultural year of 1922-23, there were 764,969,500 coffee trees in bearing in São Paulo, and in São Paulo, Minas, and Paraná, 824,194,500. Plantations having from 300,000 to 400,000 trees are common. One plantation near Ribeirão Preto has 5 million trees and requires an army of 6,000 laborers to work it. Another planter owns 32 adjacent plantations containing in all from 7,500,000 to 8 million coffee trees and gives employment to 8,000 persons. There are 15 plantations having more than 1 million trees each, and 5 of these have more than 2 million trees each. In the municipality of Ribeirão Preto, there were 30 million trees in 1922. The largest coffee plantations in the world are the Fazendas do Mar and the Fazendas Schmidt. The Fazendas do Mar were valued in 1915 in cost of land and improvements at $5,920,007. And since those figures were given out, the value of the investment has much increased. Of the various Fazenda Schmidt, the largest, owned by Colonel Francisco Schmidt in 1918, had 9 million trees with an annual yield of 200,000 bags, or 26,400,000 pounds of coffee. Other large plantations in São Paulo with 1 million or more trees are the Companhia Agricola Fazenda do Mar, 2,420,000 trees, Companhia São Martinho, 2,300,000 trees, Companhia do Mar, 2 million trees, São Paulo Coffee Company, 1,860,000 trees, Cristiana Osório de Oliveira, 1,790,000 trees, Companhia Guatapara, 1,550,000 trees, Dr. Alfredo Ellis, 1,271,000 trees, Companhia Agricola Araca, 1,200,000 trees, Companhia Agricola Ribeirão Preto, 1,138,000 trees, Rodrigues Alves Ramos, 1,060,000 trees, Francisca Silveira de Val, 1,050,000 trees, Luisa de Oliveira Azevedo, 1,045,000 trees, and the Companhia Cafeína São Paulo, 1 million trees. The average annual yield in São Paulo is estimated at from 1,750 to 4,000 pounds from 1,000 trees, while in exceptional instances it is said that as much as 6,000 pounds per 1,000 trees has been gathered. Differences in local climatic conditions, in ages of trees, in richness of soil, and in the care exercised in cultivation are given as the reasons for the wide variation. The oldest coffee-growing district in São Paulo is Campinas. There are 136 others. Bahia coffee is not so carefully cultivated and harvested as the Santos coffee. The introduction of capital and modern methods would do much for Bahia, which has the advantage of a shorter haul to the New York and the European markets. On the average, something like 70% of the world's coffee crop is grown in Brazil, and 2/3 of this is produced in São Paulo. Coffee culture in many districts of São Paulo has been brought to the point of highest development, and yet its product is essentially a quantity, not a quality one. Colombia. In Colombia, coffee is the principal crop grown for export. It is produced in nearly all departments at elevations ranging from 3,500 feet to 6,500 feet. Chief among the coffee-growing departments, Antioquia, capital, Medellin, Caldas, capital, Manizales, Magdalena, capital, Santa Marta, Santander, capital, Bucaramanga, Tolima, capital, Ibagué, and the Federal District, capital, Bogotá. The department of Cundinamarca produces a coffee that is counted one of the best of Colombian grades. The finest grades are grown in the foothills of the Andes in altitudes from 3,500 to 4,500 feet above sea level. Methods of planting, cultivation, gathering, and preparing the Colombian coffee crop for the market are substantially those that are common in all coffee-producing countries, although they differ in some small particulars. About 700 trees are usually planted to the acre, and native trees furnish the necessary shade. The average yield is 1 pound per tree per year. While Coffea arabica has been mostly cultivated in Colombia, as in the other countries of South America, the Liberica variety has not been neglected. Seeds of the Liberica tree were planted here soon after 1880 and were moderately successful. Since 1900, more attention has been given to Liberica, and attempts have been made to grow it upon banana and rubber plantations, which seem to provide all the shade protection that is needed. Liberica coffee trees begin to bear in their third year. From the fifth year, when a crop of about 650 pounds to the acre can reasonably be expected, the productiveness steadily increases until after 15 or 16 years, when a maximum of over 1,000 pounds an acre is attained. Antioquia is the largest coffee-producing department in the Republic, and its coffee is of the highest grade grown. Medellin, the capital, where the business interests of the industry are concentrated, is a handsome, white city located on the banks of the Abura River in a picturesque valley that is overlooked by the high peaks of the Andean range. It is a town of about 80,000 inhabitants, thriving as a manufacturing center, abundant in modern improvements, and is the center of a coffee production of 500,000 bags known in the market as Medellin and Manizales. Another center in this coffee region is the town of Manizales, perched on the crest of the Andean spurs to dominate the valley extending to Medellin and the Cauca Valley to the Pacific. Thereabout, many small coffee growers are settled, and several 100,000 bags of beans pass through annually. One of the most interesting plantations of the country was started a few years ago in a remote region by an enterprising American investor. It was located on the slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains, 3,000 to 5,000 feet above sea level, about 25 miles from the city of Santa Marta. An extended acreage of forest-covered land was acquired, about 600 acres of which were cleared and either planted in coffee or reserved for pasturage and other kinds of agriculture. When the plantation came to maturity, it had nearly 300,000 trees. In 1919, there were 425,000 trees producing 3,600 hundredweight of coffee. A typical Colombian plantation is the Namé, owned by one of the bankers of the Banco de Colombia of Bogota. It is located a good half-day's travel by rail and horseback from the city, about 5,000 feet above the level of the sea. There are 1,000 acres in the plantation, with 250,000 trees having an ultimate productive capacity of nearly 2,000 bags a year. During crop times, which are from May to July, about 200 families are needed on an estate of this size. Venezuela. Seeds of the coffee plant were brought to Venezuela from Martinique in 1784 by a priest who started a small plantation near Caracas. 5 years later, the first export of the bean was made, 233 bags, or about 30,000 pounds. Within 50 years, production had increased to upwards of 50 million pounds annually, and by the end of the 19th century, to more than 100 million pounds. Situated between the equator and the 12th parallel of the north latitude is the world's coffee belt. This country has an area equal to that of all the United States east of the Mississippi River and north of the Ohio and Potomac rivers, or greater than that of France, Germany, and the Netherlands combined. 599,533 square miles. The chain of the maritime Andes, reaching eastward across Colombia and Venezuela, approaches the Caribbean coast in the latter country. Along the slopes and foothills of these mountains are produced some of the finest grades of South American coffee. Here, the best coffee grows in the Tierra Templada and in the lower part of the Tierra Fria, and is known as the Café de Tierra Fria, or Coffee of the Cold, or Highland. In these regions, the equable climate, the constant and adequate moisture, the rich and well-drained soil, and the protecting forest shade afford the conditions under which the plant grows and thrives best. On the fertile lowland valleys near the coast grows the Café de Tierra Caliente, or Coffee of the Hot Land. Coffee growing has become the main agricultural pursuit of the country. In 1839, it was estimated that there were 8,900 acres of land planted in coffee, and in 1888, there were 168 million coffee trees in the country on 346,000 acres of land. In the opening years of the 20th century, not far from 250,000 acres were devoted to this cultivation, comprised in upwards of 33,000 plantations. The average yield per acre is about 250 pounds. The trees are usually planted from 2 to 2¼ meters apart, and this gives about 800 trees to the acre. The triangle system is unknown. In this country, the coffee tree bears its first crop when 4 or 5 years old. The trees are not subject to unusual hazards from the attacks of injurious insects and animals or from serious parasitic diseases. Nature is kind to them, and their only serious contention for existence arises from the luxuriant tropical vegetation by which they are surrounded. On the whole, their cultivation is comparatively easy. On the best managed estates, there are not more than 1,000 trees to a fanegada, about 1 3/4 acres of land, and it is calculated that the average annual yield for such a fanegala should be about 20 quintals, a little more than 2,032 pounds of merchantable coffee. It is to be noted, however, that the average yield per tree throughout Venezuela is low, not more than 4 ounces. There are no great coffee belts as in Mexico and Central America. Many districts are days' rides apart. The plantations are isolated, and there is lacking a cooperative spirit among the growers. Methods of cultivating and preparing the berry for the market are substantially those that prevail elsewhere in South America. Most plantations are handled in ordinary, old-fashioned ways, but the better estates employ machinery and methods of the most advanced and improved character at all points in their operation, from the planting of the seed to the final marketing of the berry. End of section 26. Read by Trish Rutter, San Diego, February 15, 2022.